This program on Edmund Burke and the American Revolutionary War from the British viewpoint with its modern implications is copyright 2019 by Richard A. Mathisen. It was presented by him on December 8, 2019 at the Breakfast Forum of the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Lehigh Valley in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
I'm interested in the American Revolution from the British point of view.
With its modern implications. And that's me. My name is Richard Mathisen, and I have been here before. As a matter of fact, I'm very happy to be back again.
Yay!
All right, okay. The American Revolutionary War from the British viewpoint and with its modern implications, which I think are huge modern implications. But we'll see if I can convince you of that. Now, my starting point is I think Americans have a narrow-minded view of the American Revolutionary War because most Americans think it was fought only in America. And I intend to show you today that this war was fought not only in America, but also in the British Parliament. In fact, that's the British Parliament. And am I right? How many Americans here are aware of the fight that took place in the British Parliament at the same time as the American Revolutionary War? Anybody? Okay, a couple. That's good. That's good. And that was held in, this is the British House of Commons, and that's one more about the 1770s. Who was in this fight in the British Parliament about the American Revolution? And on one side, there was King George III, right? And his prime minister for this whole period, 1770 to 1782, Lord Frederick North. And this was known to history as the Lord North government. And then, on the other side, was what British historians call the opposition, or the parliamentary opposition. And that was led by a former prime minister, the Marquess of Rockingham. He was prime minister in the period 65 to 66. And he, as we see, will eventually become prime minister again at the end of the war, basically to end the war. And a man named Edmund Burke, member of Parliament, who was Rockingham's private secretary, and he was also a philosopher, a historian, and a speech maker for Rockingham. And this group, the opposition, is called the Rockingham Whigs. So it's the Rockingham Whigs against the King and the Lord North government that are arguing about the American Revolutionary War. This struggle goes on for 17 years, from 1765 to 1782. And it starts with Rockingham's first term as prime minister, during which the Stamp Act had been passed in 1765. Rockingham, as prime minister, repealed it, but then he was removed as prime minister, and he had a second term in 1782 when Rockingham and Burke ended the American Revolutionary War. But it's a very complicated story. Here are the questions we're going to be looking at. What was the role of Edmund Burke and the Rockingham Whigs in starting the American Revolutionary War? Because they played a major role. And what was their role in ending the war? And finally, what are the modern implications? because I'm claiming there are huge modern implications. Okay, modern implications. One is that Edmund Burke is today regarded as the father of the modern political party. That means parties based on principles rather than patronage. Because back then, the Rockingham Whigs, when Edmund Burke joined them in 1765, were really a patronage-oriented party. And he transforms them into a party based on certain principles. And of course, today we have modern parties that have platforms, right? Principles. There are liberals and conservatives. And in the 19th century, Burke died in 1797, and in the 100 years after his death, Edmund Burke was considered a liberal hero, okay? He is today considered the founder of the Liberal Party in Britain. But then, in the 20th century, Edmund Burke was adopted by American conservatives as a conservative hero. Huh? You probably may have some intellectual whiplash at this point. How could one man be considered as a hero in the 19th century by liberals and then as a hero by conservatives in the 20th century? And I will suggest to you, is Burke a conservative or a liberal? In my opinion, Burke is not a conservative and not a liberal. He is an 18th century English politician concerned about England, not about these boxes we put people in. But his writings and his actions arguably laid the groundwork for a lot of things that still affect us today. Now, there's also a puzzling mystery, and that is, how did Great Britain, the strongest nation in the world at that time, manage to lose the Revolutionary War? Britain had just won a great victory in the 7 Years' War with France and Austria and Spain, and that's known in America as the French and Indian War. But after the American Revolution, Britain became involved in a huge struggle with Napoleon and the French, and the British defeated the French at Waterloo in 1815. So was America a great military power? I think not. And in fact, the American colonies had no army in 1776, no navy. They had no manufacturing capacity because the British policy was you manufacture in England and sell it to the colonies. And the American colonists had no money. And yet, somehow, they won. And I'm going to suggest that this concept of English freedoms or English liberties was part of the reason for England's defeat. And in the 10 years leading up to the American Revolutionary War, there was a huge amount of discussion, both in Parliament, because this is what the argument of the Rockingham Whigs is going to be about, and in America. And the Rockingham Whigs, during this period leading up to the war, were accusing the king's friends, the King of England's friends, of threatening English liberties in England, on the other side of the Atlantic. And the American colonists were accusing the king himself of threatening English liberties in America. And these two arguments are going on simultaneously. And the concept of freedom had tremendous power back then, and it still does today. In fact, I sometimes point out that if you ever, how many of you have read the Declaration of Independence all the way through? Okay, good. Well, I I read the New York Times like every day for 45 years. But if you do, you know that every July 4th, the New York Times takes a full page of newsprint to print the whole thing. And since I'm a patriotic American, I sort of grit my teeth and read it through because it's very boring. Well, after the wonderful rhetoric of the opening, then you wind up with this list where it goes on, and it says, if you read it, the king did this, the king did that, the king did this, the king did that, the king did this. And until I got into this stuff, it hadn't occurred to me, he's not saying the Parliament, he's not saying the British people, it's the king. And who else was talking about the king at this time? The Rockingham Whigs. They couldn't attack the king directly. They were talking about the king's men. It wasn't the king. Oops, sorry. But the king's men. So, we're going to... I thought I had a different slide. Okay, here is an overview of the American Revolutionary War. And there's 4 periods. And the first period is 1756 to 63, which is the 7 Years' War in Europe, known in America as the French and Indian War. Then, in 1765, we start with the attempts to tax America, the Stamp Act, right? Which was repealed, and the townshend duties, they were repealed, and then we get eventually to the Intolerable Acts. But finally, in 1775, it all is a collision. That's Lexington and Concord, right? That's when the fighting starts. Today, we're going to be looking at that attempt to tax America. We're not going to really look much at the war at all. Once the war starts, the Rockingham Whigs shut up, okay? Because the English public falls in line, as publics do, behind their government. Their soldiers are getting killed by Americans, the rebels, as we will be calling them today. And until 1781, the Rockingham Whigs do not say a lot. But 1781 is the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. And then that last period, 1781, 1782, is the ending of the Revolutionary War, with which the Rockingham Whigs are very involved, as we will see. So, I'm going to be focusing, I'm going to focus first on the 7 Years' War because it sets up the whole struggle in Parliament. And then the attempt to tax America will be covering. I'm not going to say much about the Revolutionary War itself, the fighting, because during that period the Rockingham Whigs were keeping their mouths shut. But then the ending of the war. Okay, the 7 Years' War. First of all, it was a true world war, as we will see in just a second. But in Europe, there was very little change in the European borders, despite a lot of fighting. But in America, there was a huge change in American borders. And this was a very expensive war for the British, which is why they're going to come after the Americans and try to get them to help pay for it. This is the 7 Years' War world map. And I don't know how easy it is to see anything, but what you're looking at is the blue is England and its allies. And you can see them, well, barely see them on this map, but their allies were Portugal and Prussia under King Frederick the Great, and part of Germany called Hanover because the English king was a Hanoverian monarch. And the big thing in South America, the blue, that's Brazil, which was a Portuguese. But here, when we look at it for North America, you'll see that big swatch of blue. That's all French. And the English colonies are just along the Atlantic seaboard and up to the Canadian maritime provinces like Newfoundland. But you can see all of that blue that's French. By the end of the 7 Years' War, that's all British. Okay? In other words, the English conquered Canada, and that included Quebec and all their French-speaking people. But they also conquered this whole area west of the colonies, which is primarily at that point Indian territory, we would say Native American territory. And of course, both of those were who their enemies. The war was fought between the British against the French, including the Canadians, and the Indians were mostly on the side of the French. The Indians were no fools, okay? They saw, in their terms, the French coming in as fur traders, right? And that didn't threaten them anywhere near as much as the settlers from the British who were moving west and pushing the Indians out of their lands. But anyway, you can see there was a big change in North America caused by the French and Indian War. I put this one on just to show you the Northwest Territory, because that area conquered by Britain in the 7 Years' War is what Americans call the Northwest Territory. And that's another map. But interestingly, during the war, there was a character named Colonel George Washington in a British uniform, right? And he was the leader of an attack that started the 7 Years' War in 1754. So he was fighting as a British soldier then. Of course, we know him in a different role. Now, there was a very high cost to Britain of winning the 7 Years' War. And as I said, the cost was over 60 million pounds sterling. And during that 7 years, that represented 71% of the total British budget for the 7 years. The national debt was almost doubled. And Britain now had major expenses in North America. It needed to have fortifications, forts, troops, and it had a large and restive French Catholic population in Quebec, and a large number of Native Americans, the Indians, who had been on the losing side. And this led to the desire, this financial cost, led to the desire to tax the Americans by the Stamp Act. So, leadership of Britain during the 7 Years' War. They were led by what's called the Pitt-Newcastle government. The Duke of Newcastle was the Prime Minister, and William Pitt the Elder led the war effort. And there's the Duke of Newcastle, who is a Whig leader. And there's William Pitt the Elder, who was the real leader of the war. So basically, Pitt led the war, which was the part he wanted to do, and Newcastle did all the politics, including the patronage, right? And he was also a Whig. Now, this Whig domination had started with Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, in 1721 to 42. He's considered the first Prime Minister of Britain, and he was a Whig. And he was followed by Henry Pelham, who was the brother of Newcastle, who was a Whig. He died in office and was succeeded by his brother, who was the Duke of Newcastle. And then a big change was about to occur, because in 1760, the former king, King George II, died. And he was succeeded by his grandson, known to us as King George III, and King George III had some different ideas, and here he is. Okay, 24 years old, and if you could see the look on his face, he felt that his grandfather had been pushed around by all of those Whig aristocrats, right? And he was going to come in and make some changes. And that happened in 1760. And in fact, Britain had been led by members of the Whig aristocracy for at least 40 years, and the Tories, who were considered the other party, had been kept out of government leadership. I call it historical reasons. It's basically, they were viewed as friendly to the Roman Catholics, the monarch, the Stuarts that had preceded the Whigs. And King George III invited Tories to join the government, and soon, in 1762, a Tory became prime minister for the first time, named Lord Bute, who had been King George's tutor. Remember, he's 24, but during his teenage years, Bute was this is Lord Bute. And he was the prime minister for about a year. He was a Tory, the tutor. He was also a Scot. This is the first Scot in a position of leadership. Remember, in 1707, England and Scotland had been joined to form Great Britain. And then Bute was followed by George Grenville in 1763 to 65. And Grenville has the honor or the disgrace of passing the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, that's because he had to confront the financial situation and pass the notorious Stamp Act, which is going to lead in 10 years to Lexington and Concord and the start of the war. What was Edmund Burke's role in this period? Because this is before he's involved in politics with the Rockingham Whigs. Well, he had published a 335-page book called European Settlements in America. In fact, I have it right there. An account of the European settlements in America. And the publisher was this guy named Robert Dodsley, who, that's a picture of him. He was the publisher of Samuel Johnson, you know, the Dictionary of the English Language, Alexander Pope, Thomas Gray, and the other thing that Burke had been doing was every year he's publishing something called the Annual Register. And I have a picture here of the Annual Register, 1780. This is a 500-page book every year with about 50 to 100 pages of politics all over the world. What's happening in Russia, what's happening in France, what's happening in Russia, where the Empress Catherine, one of these years, you know, executes a coup to kick her husband out of office and take over. But Burke is going through all of these detailed things throughout the world, and of course, in his first 7 years, he's talking about the 7 Years' War. Very detailed, everything that's happening, especially in America, but all the alliances, all the shifts, and that's published every year from 1758 to today. You can go out and buy the 2018 one, all right? This 500-page thing, which is basically history. It's in between journalism, you know, the newspapers and the TV that you get day by day, and the scholars who write books at the end of a period. Well, this is year by year, and it's very, very detailed, and Burke is publishing it for 30 years, every year. Although he never put his name on it, and a lot of scholars overlook the fact that that's really Burke speaking, Burke interpreting, if you would like. He's interpreting the 7 Years' War, and the Americans are reading him, and then he's interpreting the fight that goes on in the British Parliament, which he's part of. This was very hard for me to get my head around, that he was year by year at the center of things with Rockingham. He was the private secretary to Lord Rockingham. And he's writing the history of each year, including what Rockingham is doing. I mean, I just, and the Americans, this is published, it was a bestseller, the 1758 one went through 9 or 10 editions. You know, they had to keep printing it because he had a lot of human interest stuff in it. You know, the gossip and all the oddball things. You know, there was a cow that died and they opened him up and found an adder, a poisonous snake in his stomach. But I mean, I'm just giving you a sense that this is gossip. But so anyway, he has this history, then he has a chronology where he goes from January 1st, you know, what happened, sort of, you remember the murder of the such and such and whatever. And then he has poetry and he has state papers. He actually has the letters that the King of England is writing to the Empress of Russia, and she's writing back, and your most majestic Britannic Majesty. You know, this real, but this is what I would call the actual substance of history. In other words, he may write an Olympian view of what's happening, but then he gives you the actual papers. He gives you the King's address to the Lords, the King's address to Commons, Commons' response to the King, the Lord, you know, in other words, he's giving you all the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of history, year after year. Now, what is his significance prior to 1765? His political career is often thought to date from 1765 when he joined Rockingham and became private secretary. But this overlooks the fact that he wrote this textbook on European settlements. He was very interested in the European settlements and particularly in trade because he saw, and we'll get to this, but I may as well say it now, he saw that the way Spain and Portugal and France had handled their colonies was really bad for the nations. Basically, they were exploiting their colonies and not looking to have any kind of mutual relationship. The British were doing it the right way and focusing on trade. Now, there's a particular kind of trade, we're going to get to this, called mercantilism, basically merchantness, where Britain wanted the colonies to not have manufacturing, so the British manufacturers would do more manufacturing, the British merchants would do more selling, and the British ships would carry the trade. And this trade would make Britain richer. And that was the way Britain handled its colonies. And the other nations were doing it the wrong way, in Burke's view. And I think he makes a very good case. But, so that's why he becomes very opposed to things like the Stamp Act, which he thinks are heavy-handed and not really what Britain should be doing. Okay, so here we're back to our overview of the American Revolutionary War. We've covered the 7 years period, and now we're going to start in on the attempt to tax America. So Britain passes the Stamp Act in 1765, and Americans love to pay taxes, right? Wrong. The Americans reacted by boycotting English goods. And remember, the British policy was mercantilism. The colonies were forbidden to manufacture, and they would buy manufactured goods from Britain, and the manufacturers were happy, and then the merchants were happy because they had to sell them, and then the ship owners were happy. Well, the boycott stopped all that, and of course, the manufacturers and the merchants and the ship owners all went to Parliament and said, hey, stop this, you know, you're really messing up our business. And the response was the George Grenville government, which had passed this, fell. It got kicked out of Parliament and was replaced by a government led by the Marquess of Rockingham. He became Prime Minister on July 10th, 1765, and within a week he had hired Edmund Burke as his private secretary. And then the Rockingham government passed the next year 2 acts. One was a declaratory act saying Parliament has the right to tax the colonies. And the other was the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay? But then the Rockingham government fell because the king never liked them, and as soon as he could get rid of them, he did. Now, after Rockingham left office the first time, there's 3 particular events I want to focus on. 1770, Edmund Burke gave a speech called Thoughts on the Present Discontents. And this was, I would say, probably the best example of what Edmund Burke was doing with the Rockingham Whigs. He wanted to have a public statement of their policy, why what they were doing was right and what the government was doing was wrong, and particularly the king and the king's attack on English liberties. But he wouldn't say the king, he would say the friends of the king. They were the bad ones. And what were they doing? What they were doing, the attack on English liberties, was really an attack on the Whigs, of which he was a part, and who were the huge landowners. The Marquess of Rockingham, one of the richest men in England. You know, he's got an annual income of £2 million from all of his territories, and, you know, lives on a big estate. And but what they're worried about is the king is taking power from Parliament, where in Parliament the people are represented. Now, we need to remember we should not consider this a modern democracy, right? I think the number of people who had the vote is 4% or something like that. Well, you know, you had to be a landowner and you had to be male and, you know. But it was, but it was the only functioning democracy or semi-democracy in the world at this time. And I think I can say that. I've been trying to find if there's anything else, but it was a, you know, it was a pace setter in terms of its government. And when Burke wrote this speech, he didn't just write it himself and give it as his speech. He wrote it, and then it went to Rockingham, and then it went to Newcastle, and then it went, you know, it went through all of these people who are part of this Whig coalition, went through 8 drafts that we know of. And then it was published. It was published and circulated widely. Remember, this is the opposition leader of the British government in Parliament criticizing the king or the king's friends about an attack on English liberties. Now, who else is talking about an attack on English liberties at this time? The Americans, right? They have been taxed by the Stamp Act, and then it was okay, but things are heating up in the 1770s. But he gives 2 more speeches. 1774, he gave a speech called On American Taxation, where he's saying exactly why this is a bad idea for Britain. And then a speech called On Conciliation with the Colonies. And as we'll find out, that's given in 1775, about 29 days prior to Lexington and Concord. In other words, the speech could never hit America before the fighting had started. So then we come to the battles of Lexington and Concord. This is an actual, that's an illustration of the printed speech. In other words, this was not only reported in newspapers, it was printed and published by our friend Dodsley, the publisher. And then, of course, In December 1773, the government of Britain put in the tea tax, reactivated. It was sort of there, but the East India Company, which was controlling India, right, had a lot of excess tea. So anyway, they suddenly started dumping that on the market, and the Americans reacted. I don't know if you can see this, but that's Americans dressed up as Indians, okay? They're dressed up as Indians, tossing it overboard, and then of course the governor of Massachusetts says, "We got to arrest the people who did this." And everybody says, oh, who did it? Oh, it was those Native Americans, right? Well, no, but this is the governor, Thomas Hutchins, royal governor, who is probably the bad guy in American history because he was very pompous and full of I am the governor and I represent the king. And he's writing letters to the bigwigs in Parliament or in the king's cabinet about how bad the Americans are. Now he has sort of a point, because back in 1765 when the Stamp Act was passed, the colonists rebelled against it and a whole mob came and burned his house down. So he probably was not too happy with Americans. But he's writing these letters to England, and then I think we know who Benjamin Franklin was, right? He was a famous scientist, invented electricity, or that wrote about it in 1751, and he became a diplomat and a statesman. But Franklin is spending a lot of time in England, and Franklin comes into possession of the letters. And Franklin sends them over to America. Now, we don't know whether they got leaked. They got leaked and published in the newspapers. All these letters from Hutchinson criticizing the Americans in all of these nasty terms. And you can imagine what the American reaction was. So anyway, that led, among other things, to, this all happened in 1773. That led to the Boston Tea Party. And then, because Franklin's in England, he gets hauled in front of the king. And the king's privy minister spends 4 hours, and Franklin is standing there like this, 4 hours of tongue lashing of Franklin. Now Franklin had been friendly to Britain before. After this, I don't know if it was because of that, but all of a sudden Franklin becomes a rabid rebel. Yeah. And is a leading figure in the organization of the colonies. So, this is Burke's speech on American taxation, just to show you the pamphlet from April 1774. And then on conciliation with the American colonies in March 22nd of 1775, and just to jump ahead, that's the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th. Like I said, 29 days later. But I want to talk about this conciliation with the colonies because this was, this is really fun to read. Because Burke is going through from the very beginning. Remember, he had written the history of European settlement. And he's going back and he says to Britain, look at the people you sent over to America, right? The Pilgrims in 1620 and the Puritans in 1630, right? They were your hardcore rebels. You know, they were persecuted. They went over there. You know, you're not dealing with people over there who are nice, normal English people. These are the hard-nosed, tough-minded people who the British had already had enough of with Oliver Cromwell and the Cromwell Protectorate. But he's reminding them, and he's also reminding them, you know, the Quakers, who were very tough in this era. They went over to Pennsylvania. And he says even the planters in the South, this is Virginia, North and South
The
Carolina,
Irish, many of them were.
even though they were Church of England, because that was their church, they were, because they had slaves, and this is Burke talking to the British Parliament, just because they were very conscious of their freedom and the difference between free and slave, and anything that threatened them with what they considered slavery, like the British king enslaving them, which is the way they began talking about it, was something they were very eager to combat. And so we're going on with this slavery and this slavery image. And well, anyway, Burke is laying the groundwork. He's giving the Americans all the arguments they need to oppose the British rule, even though that's not what he's trying to do. He thinks they're right to oppose this, but he's not a supporter of the revolution. He's a sympathizer with the revolution. So then we come to Lexington and Concord. And now I'm going to start talking about what this was all about. But let me just stop for a second. I don't know if I've raised questions in your mind. Frank?
No, just a comment. While you're talking about the relation of the English with the American colonies, side by side there was a whole nother trouble between the English and the Irish.
Yes.
And again, it was very similar to this, and both played out in, unfortunately, very different ways.
And what's interesting is that Edmund Burke is Irish. Yeah, I mean, he's converted, his father converted to Anglican. But he is very much Irish, and I'll come to a book later on that examines his whole career in terms of that Irishness and how he felt bad, but he was not in a position to say or do anything because the English view of the Irish was always their Catholicism and the fact they had rebelled several times against Britain. So that was the way Britain looked at it.
Yeah, I'm concerned that you don't mention the King's role as the CEO of the East English Company, East India Company, and his role as the Pope of the Anglican Church,
Yeah,
and that you didn't mention India. You know,
yeah,
America was small potatoes, 3 million people. We're talking like 300 million people in India. So they had a distraction going on over there. And it
Yeah.
really didn't show on the map.
yeah, yeah. And all of these arguments in the Parliament are about policy towards America, but also policy towards India, policy towards the West Indies. You know, the British colonies are very much involved in this, and it is Burke's position that these are Englishmen over across the Atlantic, and of course the king is looking at them, oh, they're a bunch of subject people, you know.
Servants.
And that's the clash that's going on here, certainly in King George's mind. Did I see another question here? Yeah.
I'm curious as to how his speech was received by his peers.
They said that people in Parliament were crying. Burke was a tremendous speaker, and we know that it made an impression, but of course it didn't change anybody's mind because they were thinking of this in terms of the Boston Tea Party and the violence in the colonies, because, you know, Americans were becoming more and more upset with Britain, and there were attacks going on against the loyalists, and that was what the British royal court and the parliament and the British newspapers. The British newspapers were playing up, the bad things that the Americans did. But it was very hard to, if you read his speech, it's very hard to argue with anything he said. And so I'll just give you an example of Burke's speeching style. He talks at one point, it's not this one, but another one, he says, he's talking about how he views the prime ministers passing the Stamp Act and other ones as saying, well, we have the right to tax and let's go do it. And Burke says, yeah, it's like you have sheep and you get wool from the sheep, right? You have the right to do that. And then you look over and you see the wolf and you say, oh, they got fur. Yeah, we have the right to shear the wolf. And he says, but maybe you better think about what the wolf's going to do, referring to the American colonists. You're going to try to shear this wolf. It's a kind of vivid image that Burke uses, and it's a lot of fun to read Burke, actually, just because I find myself laughing out loud all the time at the images that he uses. Any other questions?
Is there a book about Burke or Ivory
Yeah.
or whatever that you can recommend to us?
Yeah, and I actually am going to show you the ones that I think are valuable, at least the ones that I found valuable. I read a whole bunch of them, but there's a few that...
Pick one.
Yeah. So what was Burke's philosophy? And he is famous for one quote, which says, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
You bet.
Now, nobody can find this where he said it. So, there's some doubt, but the fact is, it represents his philosophy in a nutshell, because what he is saying to the Whigs in England and to the English people is that we have to protect our English freedom by gathering together and making sure that we are united, the people who care about freedom, and in this case, in this period, it's the Whigs and the Rockingham Coalition who are worried about the king and his attack on English liberties, or certainly his attack on the aristocracy and trying, now, the opposite way of looking at it is the king is in a power struggle with those aristocrats. And he's trying to get his way by using the powers of the king. But they're not looking at it that way. Anyway, he's trying to organize the Rockingham Coalition, and he's doing it by these speeches, which then everybody recognizes that when Burke speaks, he's not speaking as one person, he's speaking as somebody representing the Rockingham Whigs. Okay, here is the first answer to your question. The Rise of Party in England. This is a book by Frank O'Gorman. And O'Gorman has another book I found very helpful called The Long 18th Century. In other words, he's going to cover from 1688, the Glorious Revolution, up to 1832, which is when they finally gave the vote to a lot more people. But you want to get the second edition of that, because that came out, I don't know, 20, 50 years. But here he's talking, O'Gorman in this book is talking about the Rockingham Whigs. The Rockingham Whigs, 1760 to 1782. 1760 is when George III came in and the Rockingham Whigs lost control of patronage. Remember, the Rockingham Whigs are about patronage. It's hard for us to, in America it was often called the spoil system, right? The person who becomes president or Congress can appoint a certain number of jobs. And that's a powerful thing. Now, in the case of the Rockingham Whigs, what they really wanted to do was to have the prime ministership and the ability to control foreign policy, because they believed their policy of emphasis on trade, using the Navy to protect the trade lanes, rather than big army establishment, which they were always scared to death of. So basically, Burke during this period is organizing the Rockingham Whigs to oppose the king. And this book drew, about Edmund Burke in America. Remember I was telling you how in America Burke was viewed as a liberal in the 19th century, both in America and England, and then became viewed as a conservative in the 20th century. And he's sort of analyzing that. People like Woodrow Wilson were big fans of Edmund Burke all the way into, the 1920s and 1930s. And then it sort of switched. I'm looking around for Victor, but
Oh, he's in the kitchen.
anyway, and I'll tell you why in a second. But and here's a book by Yuval Levin called The Great Debate. And Levin, you can see the subtitle, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left. And talking about how when Burke became viewed as a conservative, then Thomas Paine was his opposite number. And you can trace a lot of the arguments in the modern political arena right back to those opposing viewpoints. Yeah. Victor, I'm just talking about a person named Thomas Paine.
I heard it already, I recorded it.
Okay, and the book here is called The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left, where this author in 2014 is tracing the modern debate between liberals and conservatives back to Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. Because Edmund Burke in the 20th century became viewed as a conservative, whereas liberal in the 19th century. Frank?
Semantics trips us up so many times. Many people consider modern Republicans as liberals in the sense that they believe in economic freedom, which was the Burkean sense of liberalism.
Yeah, and in fact, let's just follow up on that, because what happens is the Whig Party in England became the Liberal Party. So Burke really is the founder of the Liberal Party. But then the Liberal Party split into the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. Here, I'm weak on British political history, but I think that's and the Tories became the modern Conservative Party. But that Liberal Party separate from Labour, because the Labour Party was more socialistic and the Liberal Party, England had three parties for quite a while. The Conservatives, the Labour, and the Liberal Party. And that, I think that goes back to that same thing. So this is a debate, but this is the debate where Burke became considered a conservative in the 20th century. Whereas, I think, here is my oversimplified way, apologies to Victor, but oversimplified, I'd say, when in the 19th century Burke was considered a liberal, it's because of his position on America. And his position on India, where he opposed the abuse of power, the abuse of British power in India. But when he became a favorite of the conservatives, they were going up against communism. That goes back to the French Revolution. Because, as I know, Victor knows, during the American Revolution, there were two Englishmen very involved. One was Thomas Paine, who went over and wrote a book called Common Sense, in which he was claiming
Rights of man.
rights, and, well, no. If he had written the Rights of Man, he would have been ignored in America. And it was after because Common Sense, Thomas Paine presented himself as being a believer in God, and, he's not doing his anti-Christianity thing at that point. And if he were, his book wouldn't have been. Then, later on, he's ignored in America by a lot of people when he comes out very much stridently anti-church. So yeah, everybody's evolving in this period.
Yeah,
But
This
meanwhile,
debate is about rights of man. The great debate is about rights of man.
yeah, the great debate is about the French Revolution, and where Edmund Burke was very opposed to the French Revolution and Thomas Paine was very supportive. So that's where the modern thing comes. And I would say, this is an opinion, you take it for what it's worth, I would say that it had a lot to do with communism and the fight against communism of conservatives in America who saw a number of similar arguments against communism to Burke's arguments about the French Revolution. Now, you don't have to accept that. I'm just saying that I think that was what generated. Yeah, it's really. I mean, I'm trying to avoid liberal and conservative this morning, okay? Because I'm talking about the Revolutionary War when Burke is considered a liberal. But when you get into the second debate about the French Revolution, oh, here I happen to have Thomas Paine, Common Sense, 1776, and became a very powerful book for the rebel side, the rebels in America. And then this was Edmund Burke, when he opposed the French Revolution. It's in 1790. The French Revolution had barely begun. And the English, many of the English people, especially the liberal friends of Burke, were big supporters of the French Revolution. And Burke says, no way, this is horrible. And he really goes, whoa. And the result was that his party, remember by this time Rockingham is dead, and Charles Fox is in charge of his party. And Charles Fox is a big supporter of the French Revolution. And Burke in the same party is against it. And they clash, and Charles Fox kicks Burke out of his own party because of his opposition to the French Revolution. Then later on, when the revolution turns back, they execute the king and Marie Antoinette, and the guillotine starts cutting off, then the streets are running with blood. Then people start saying, oh, but it really was, and then of course, Burke had predicted the French Revolution that they would wind up with a strong man taking over, and of course that was Napoleon. And then the British are in a fight for their very life against Napoleon. So it's hard to say that Edmund Burke predicted that, but actually, to a certain extent, he predicted what was going to happen in the American Revolution, right, in advance. He said, you are making a big mistake. And it turned out that way. Of course, nobody was happy about it. The people who predict doom and it happens never get any applause. So, now I'm going to start talking about the end of the war, but let me stop and see if we have any questions at this point. I just want to see.
Yeah, the American Revolution was over in 1775. Then it was the War of Independence.
Right.
So I would change your definition of that.
Yeah.
And also, rights of man was done about the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen.
Yeah.
Way better than our Bill of Rights. And that came out in August of 1789.
Yeah.
So we're talking human rights, common sense human rights, rights of man, human rights.
Yeah, it's much later. It's much later.
And United Nations human rights.
Yeah. Okay, other questions? Okay, I'm going to do a little quick bit on the end of the war because Burke and Rockingham were involved in that. It starts with the surrender of Cornwallis, the British general, at Yorktown, October 19th, 1781. Here the dates become very important. And it takes a month until November 23rd for the news to reach London. what happens, you know, in American history, you find that when Yorktown happens, that they think the war is over. No way. The king was not at all about, and in fact, he went to Parliament a few days later after getting the news and said, "We will fight on, we will fight on." The problem is that at this point, and I'll go to this next slide, did Edmund Burke help end the American Revolutionary War? The surrender of Cornwallis did not end it because George III steadfastly refused to grant independence. And meanwhile, Lord North, the Prime Minister, was losing his hold on the House of Commons because the votes that had been 250 to 140 or 110 now were becoming 230 to 170, and finally there were a couple of votes. I was originally going to put all this stuff in, but it got too detailed. But you know, they were like 220 to 250, and you know, in the House of Commons, if you lose votes, then they can call for a vote of no confidence, and that's what happened in early February. And finally, on March 20th, Lord North resigned, and on the 27th, the Marquess of Rockingham, who's Burke's boss, became Prime Minister. And that, in my view, is when the war ended. And the reason that happened was that when they were losing votes, the king sent one of his emissaries to talk to Rockingham about becoming Prime Minister, because it looked like it was going to have to happen whether the king liked it or not. And Rockingham sent this note that is just astonishing. The king must not veto American independence if the Parliament passes it. And George was thunderstruck. And in fact, there are documents that have come to light where King George has drafted an abdication statement. He is actually going to abdicate rather than lose America. And he doesn't go through with it, but at least the first draft talked about how 21 years ago when I became king. Now, he became king in October of 1760, so that's the end, right around the time of the Cornwallis surrender is 21 years. So it's early 1782, and that showed how strongly he was opposed. Now, he finally capitulated, and depending on who you want to listen to, you could say Burke caused it, or Rockingham caused it, or neither did. Because what also is going on, remember, in the American Revolutionary War, after the Declaration of Independence, 1736, the French join in 1778, allied with the Americans, because they're so ticked off at the British about ridding all of Canada and stuff. Then the Spanish join in with the Americans on 1779, and then the Dutch join in. Britain is fighting a war against almost doesn't have any allies. They're all, you know, and people are saying, you know, and if you're losing in Yorktown, you know, why are we fighting everybody just to keep these colonies, which don't want to be part of us anyway? Anyway, you were asking about books. This is Connor Cruz O'Brien called The Great Melody. And The Great Melody, Frank, is about, about the abuse of power, and it's directed towards Ireland, America, India, and eventually the French Revolution. But that's a biography of Burke that's sort of broken down into these. Then, if you get into the diplomacy, which is very complicated, you want to read Samuel Flagbemus, The Diplomacy, where he's talking about, you know, France doesn't care about America. France is out to stick it to Spain. Spain doesn't care about America. They're out to get Gibraltar back from, you know, it's like there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. That's Edmund Burke. Here's a book he wrote on the ideas of sublime and beautiful. naturally. Here is the other book you were asking, The War for America, by a British historian. Very few people had written about the American war from the British side because it was a loss. Who wants to? But he wrote that. That's I had the date here, I thought, but I can't see it. Okay. Here's a book by Bernard Bailey. This is The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. This won a book prize, but well, that's Samuel Johnson, who is a good friend of. Okay, I'm going to close with a few summary statements here, and this may generate debate. And you have 5 minutes, I think. But Britain was the only representative democracy or semi-democracy, but you need to have at least 2 responsible parties to make democracy work. So Britain was just going through that, and Edmund Burke was a part of that process. From the Glorious Revolution until King George III, the Whigs dominated, and the Tories were even prevented from holding office because of their connection to the Catholics. And under Whig prime ministers, there was a consistent foreign policy of mercantilism, trade, and colonies, being used to the benefit by trade. With King George III, Tories were invited, and they viewed the American colonies as a source of income from taxes rather than a trading party. And that caused the Rockingham Whigs to go against the king and say, you are threatening the liberties of Englishmen because you're taking away our rule when we're doing the correct policies. And all of this opposition was publicized and overheard by the American colonists. The Whigs had controlled under the 3 prime ministers, and the Whigs were worried about losing patronage. They had been naming people to these. And Burke's role was to guide them in the direction of a party based on principles, like the speech on the present discontents or American taxation. Americans interpreted these things in England in terms of their own needs, and especially their fight against the king about his power and the threat to freedom from the king to them. And the result of the American Revolutionary War, I said, was to double the number of democracies in the world from 1 to 2, from Britain alone to Britain and the United States. The United States, as originally formed, the Articles of Confederation, did not have political parties. And that as late as 1787, there were no political parties in America. That's the Constitutional Convention. And the Electoral College, among other things, was a nonpartisan choice of president. That then when parties came up, this is at the end of Washington, the John Adams Federalist Party and the Thomas Jefferson Republican Party, that's what they called it, then they have to adapt the Electoral College system to parties, which is controversial. But and thank you. I'll be back in 3 weeks.
We'll accept that. Wonderful.